Learning Ally is a proud sponsor of the Empower Dyslexia podcast. Learning Ally, a nonprofit education organization, helps to transform the lives of struggling learners by delivering proven solutions that help students reach their potential. We have a heritage of supporting students with a reading deficit like dyslexia. Our award-winning human-read audiobook solution helps students in grades 3 through 12 access books they want and need to read to help them succeed. Visit www.learningally.org for more information.
The following content is not intended as a substitute for professional legal advice, medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your attorney, advocate, physician, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding any medical or educational concerns.
Hello and welcome to Empower Dyslexia. I'm Stephen Yearout, and we're here to help you be a better informed partner in education. On this show, we discuss dyslexia and other related disorders, research, intervention, special education policy at the local, state, and federal level. We also interview experts in their field, and I think almost the most important people or guests we have are the people with their personal stories. Please make sure that you like us on Facebook, follow us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, hit the little bell, because we love to understand, or we love to know that what we're doing is exactly what you need. So if you like to hear the audio version, we're on every app that you can imagine, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, TuneIn, iHeartRadio is new. And if you're watching this live, it's either Facebook Live or YouTube Live. So again, please like us on them, subscribe, leave us a comment. Our sponsor, Learning Ally, has given us a gracious discount code. So if you would like to order a new family membership, you can use the discount code ED20 on checkout and get 20% off a new family membership. There you go. So it's www.learningally.com or .org, sorry, www.learningally.org. Today is a show that has been a long time coming, and I've been wanting to do a show around this topic for a long time because we all talk about the pipeline to prison. And I met our guest earlier this year, and we've talked back and forth about having him come on the show. He's a deputy sheriff. He's also a school resource officer. His name is David Agata. And today's topic, he's really going to talk about how do we stop that pipeline to prison. And he did a master capstone proposal, and he named it Operation Algorithm. So, hello, David, and welcome to our show.
Hey, how are you? Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's a great honor to have you here. To start, can you give our guests a little bit more information about who you are, some of your duties that you have being a deputy sheriff and an SRO officer or school resource officer? Tell us why you advocate for children with learning disabilities.
So I started my law enforcement career in the state of Florida in 1989. I've actually worked for several agencies. That whole thing about retiring, yeah, I guess so. But I've retired from one agency. I've worked for a number of others. Presently, I work in Central Florida for a county in Central Florida, which is on the east coast of Florida. And I've been here for about 3 years. I've done some of the needed stuff I think you could probably do in law enforcement, from uniform patrol to specialized units. I've been a SWAT cop since 1996, and I'm a police sniper back. They got a 56-year-old guy who's back on their sniper team working with them only because I've been doing it so long. And as I tell the staff at the school that I work at an elementary school. It's probably the best job I've ever had, was working with kids at the elementary school level, because the bottom line is you know exactly where you stand. I mean, it's just, they're wide open and there's no nonsense, no filters on the kids. And it's just a great time. I've been doing that for about 2 years. That happened after the Douglas incident. Many of the officers that you saw running into Marjorie Stoneman Douglas were police officers from the city of Coral Springs, and I had worked for the city of Coral Springs for 20 years. And in 2000 and 2001, we began, I say we who were on the SWAT team, saying to the administration, we really, really need to teach our personnel how to deal with active shooter incidents and active threat incidents. And at great personal I don't want to say great personal risk, but at great personal expense, and probably some, I wouldn't say career ending, but I had to make some pretty tough decisions to say, hey, we really need to do this. And as opposed to going with the flow, said, hey, I think this will make a difference. I was working patrol on February 14th, 2018 here in the county I work in, which is in Central Florida. The only reason I'm not mentioning it is because I didn't get permission. So it's probably inappropriate for me to say what county, but needless to say, I was receiving phone calls, and I'm like, I'm fine. I'm taking reports. I'm in uniform on patrol. They're like, do you know what's going on? And I'm like, not where I'm at. Later that evening, I started getting the phone calls from many of the guys and gals that I had trained and worked with for many years to find out what was occurring. And over the next several weeks, was able to kind of share what was going on, and kind of knew what was going to end up in that report only because out of confidence, they were just like, hey, here's what's up. I just need to talk. So long story short, I realized that that's something that I just felt really personally responsible for, in a good way, that they were able to do the job they were. Many don't know that they saved as many as those that were killed that day. There was probably as many that were saved based on their medical training and a bunch of other stuff. Needless to say, the state of Florida in about, I want to say May or April, passed a bill 7026 that said that every educational facility in the state of Florida will have either a law enforcement officer, either contracted by the county, the city, or their own police department, or what they're calling a guardianship program. And basically, it's a hired gun that works at the schools. Well, I grew up working as a law enforcement officer in the city of Coral Springs, and in the early 80s, or the late 80s when I went to work for them, they had already had an established program. And one of the things that they did was community-oriented policing, which meant, how do we take responsibility for what's going on in our community? How do we do process improvement? How do we move forward? And it was just part of our culture that officers would work in the schools. The only reason I didn't get involved with it then was because it was more of a dating relationship. So if you had a bad date, with the law enforcement officer and the administration, you could be back out on patrol, which was not a bad thing. Just, it wasn't committed. Today, as I like to say, law enforcement is married to the educational system. And I think we always have been. We just didn't know. We were just living together, if you will. Now it's just official. And I think it goes beyond just security and safety. Yes, that's my primary duty. However, the relationships we build and the things that we learn every day is critical. So kind of a long answer, but does that kind of give you an overview of where I'm at?
Absolutely. And I mean, my relationships with our SRO officers that are here in my hometown are amazing. And, they, just as much as they go out and protect our kids, they're also, like you said, building that relationship with these kids and getting them to understand that, hey, yes, I may be in a place of authority, but I still care for you. I still love you. I still want the best for you. And which I think that's definitely what our kids need these days.
Oh, absolutely eye-opening. I will say that, there were some kids that I don't know if I feel comfortable because, you're a law enforcement officer. And I'm like, hey, I'm just going to eat lunch. You mind if I sit here and eat with you guys? And they were like, sure. And, we're talking everything from VBK, pre-kindergarten, to sixth grade, because we have sixth grade in our elementary schools. So, it's a great opportunity to build bridges and really get to know, what's going on. And it's also been very eye-opening for education. And that's one of the things we're going to obviously talk about here.
Absolutely. So, why do you advocate? I mean, we talked about your passion for obviously protecting our kids, our vulnerable, and building that relationship. Is there any other reasons why you advocate so strongly for our children with learning disabilities?
So, long story short, I started my education about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 2013, getting my higher education, starting my bachelor's degree and working really, really hard to work through that, and was working and contracting, was overseas, was teaching international, which, by the way, learning to teach people when they speak another language and you have a translator really, really presses you. I'm a trainer by trade, not just a SWAT cop and a law enforcement officer, but a trainer. And I learned a lot over these last 30 years of how to teach people, how to train adults, and recognize some of my own shortfalls. Well, during my education, one of the primary things you have to do is read material. And reading has always been extremely difficult for me. Didn't know why. I just figured, maybe I wasn't interested. I'll just work harder. Having to learn things, I'd have to read and reread and read, and then read out loud, because you write reports for a living. So you're reading and writing. And, one of the tricks I had was just reading my reports out loud, whether I was handwriting it. Now all the kids get to type it and have, word check and all that. I had a dictionary when I started. So dictionary and whiteout. So reading was always a tough part. So I kind of got that. Grew up going to school and being told I was lazy. I was really smart, but I was lazy. And I'm like, I don't know that I'm lazy. I don't get it. So that's kind of the history of my education, up to and including my master's degree, which I spent the last 2.5 years working on. And it's an online program, really, really good school, American Military University, great staff. But, I was reading research material, probably 4, 5, 6 different research papers a week, And you know how long those are. I mean,
Right.
you and I have gotten to know each other, and when you start reading research, you got to learn how to read that stuff. And it was painful, some of it. I mean, fortunately, it was material I knew about because I've been in law enforcement for 30 years, and my education, my degree is in criminal justice, but it was hard. I don't know if I can share with you what happened during the last year of doing the research for my thesis program.
Sure.
I happened to meet. Now I live in Flagler County, and I was out on love the beach. Was out at Flagler Beach at one of our favorite fish taco places. My wife and I on Sundays. That's where we go after church. And the place was packed. The place is about the size of a phone booth, and everything else is outside. There's a bunch of people there. Best fish tacos on the beach. And gentleman sat down and said, "Hey, do you mind if I sit here?" I'm like, "Sure." And just based off of my personality, I could have a conversation with, the napkin box and have fun with it. Needless to say, this gentleman was really, really a good guy. We got to know, my wife, Sharon, and I got to talking with him. And then he told me his name, and I'm like, "Yeah, you're a liar. That was funny. Get out. We're leaving." He says, "No, my name is Tim Conway." And I went, "Get out of here, dude. I grew up watching Carol Burnett. What are you trying to hustle me out of money?" He's like, "No, really. My name is Dr. Tim Conway." And I was like, "Okay, what kind of doc are you?" And he says, "Well, I'm a neuroscientist." I said, "You're a brain surgeon?" He says, "Not exactly." And we laughed about it. And we talked just a bit that day. And I said, "Hey, wait, maybe we'll see you next Sunday because this is the best fish tacos in Flagler Beach." Sure enough, we saw him again, and we started talking, and being the curious type that I am, as my son has to tell me, he's 31 years old, he's like, "Dad, sometimes you miss social cues because you start talking to people like you're interviewing them." And I'm like, "Oh, sorry." So I started asking some pointed questions, and he started telling me what his background was. And I went, "That's really interesting." And he said, "One of the things I specialize in is dyslexia." And I was like, "Okay." And he started giving me all the medical stuff and all the type of difference that, kind of the general overview of what he does. And I'm like, "Yeah, okay, cool. Good to know." And then he said, we changed topics in the topic, and we're talking about Department of Justice. Well, back to, this is about a year ago, I was in the midst of my master's program, which meant I was doing a ton of research on DOJ and Department of Justice and what the statistics were and all kinds of different topics. And he says, "Well, let me tell you about this." And he started talking about reading disorders and how they impact those that are incarcerated. And I went, "Okay, cool." Well, I left there, and like any other good cop, if somebody says something that kind of sparks an interest, you'll go look. And being that I had access to the research he was talking about, not only did I research him and realize that he was all that and a bag of chips, based on all of the research that I could find. He and probably a group of a dozen, probably most of the people that you've talked about on your show at some point or another. And I started looking at the numbers, and I was struck by two things. One, his numbers were spot on. And two, they were so underestimated. And I guess three, I started realizing I think I might have a reading disorder. I might even have dyslexia. So the next time that we met with him, I said, "Hey, tell me more about this." And he started talking about some of the red flags that parents will have, inability to remember certain names, mispronouncing certain words, inability about reading. We started talking about reading stuff. And I was like, "Dude, tell me more about this." And then finally I said, "What's the deal? What do you do? I mean, what's different? I mean, I've started reading some of your research. Talk to me a little bit." And we started talking about, language, and then reading, and then how they interact, and the struggles. Because listen, the only time I had heard dyslexia is when my son was going into first grade, and they said, "Yeah, your kid has dyslexia." I'm like, "What? He sees letters backwards?" And they were unable to explain it to me. They were like, "No, but we're going to have to do special stuff." Like what? Put him on meds? I mean, what are we talking about here? Just such a lack of ability to explain to me what the disorder was. We blew it off and did homeschooling. P.S. I started listening to the way they were doing research and what they were talking about for education, and I was seeing the parallels between those that are incarcerated, those that can't read, and then I was seeing the correlation between how they were intervening or doing interventions. They're multi-sensory, and how they did that, and how, how refined law enforcement and adult education really needs to be, considering all the things we have to do. And it sparked an interest, and I spent the next year doing my research, digging in to find out, one, that I was dyslexic, two, there were some things that I could do to fix that, but more importantly, the blaring obvious was, the high percentage of those that are incarcerated can't read. And I thought it was just Nancy Reagan being silly, saying, yeah, if we help people to read, they won't get in prison. And I was like, yeah, that's really nice. But I didn't realize what that really meant.
Absolutely. When I first started doing my research, when I was doing my advocacy work with my boys, that was one of the things. I was up late at night Googling everything that I could find, and I came across this study. And the study was about the Texas prisons.
Mm-hmm.
And the more and more I got into it, the more and more, at this point, it was probably 4:00 in the morning, and
right.
I couldn't stop reading it. And I knew that could/should have been me.
Correct. I get that.
And
so we're on the same track. I get it.
And now I know it's one of those things that I often say I can't unsee what I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
And
Sure.
I wonder, how many of our incarcerated adults, and, back then they were kids, how many of them could have had a completely different life if it wasn't for, the inability to teach them to read and do math, and having that success in education and allowing them to, grow and go out and be a productive member of society.
Sure, absolutely.
And, I say this all the time, that if I have to fight this hard for my kids, I'm fighting for all kids.
Well, here's the bottom line. Once I started looking at it and starting to I started gathering all of my research, and there was probably somewhere between 30 and 40 research. And a lot of that happened to have Dr. Tim Conway. And I know there are people that are adversarial towards the doc. I don't care. I just don't care, because I know after a year of my life at this, I get it. And I'll share a little bit about the interventions that I've been doing. But I was 9 years old. The only way I learned to read was comic books, because that's the only way I could comprehend what I was reading. I got lucky. And I didn't read that well, but at least I started learning comprehension, because I couldn't read. At 9 years old, to kind of put you back behind the curve. High school, hot mess in high school. Just got through by the skin of my teeth, and only because a couple of people were able to help me, but my scores were horrible. And again, it wasn't for lack of trying. And if I was told one more time that I was lazy, I was like, I'm going to punch somebody, because I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
And pushing forward, here I am looking through all the research and seeing that we're looking at somewhere between 50 to 80% of those in the population. A lot of people get uptight about that. And the only reason is, and I'll qualify it as, it's the way the different states and federal prisons and jails will keep their numbers and what they use. So we know somewhere between 50 to 80% of the people that are incarcerated have reading disorders. We know 76% don't have a high school diploma. We know, the numbers are just staggering. They're almost like not believable. It's almost like fiction. Like, I don't believe it. No way. Is it that simple? And when I was doing my research, I said, well, this is an Occam razor deal. I mean, what's the simplest solution? Okay, how do we teach it? And that was one of the questions I said to Doc Conway. And I was like, hey, Doc, why is this such a big, because I remember them trying to tell us what they were going to have to do with my son. And I'm like, that don't make no sense. And then I started looking at all these different programs, and I'm not going to berate any of these programs, but there are programs that are like super stupid and expensive. They take years and years and years. And the ability for them to work at the end, it was like, what? I mean, how do I fix this? Is it fixable? Am I living with, like an incurable disease? Because that's how I was looking at that. And that's why my research was so emphatic, was not only because I was looking at numbers going, wow, after 31 years in law enforcement, I started in 1989. We had community policing. We were always looking on how do we work with the community? How do we deal with crime? We were always looking at it from where are we hurting? What are we doing? How do we work together? And it was always systemic. It was always like, let's see if we can get past the symptoms and get to the cause. And that's when the broken window came out. Well, if it's a broken window, you fix it and you help the neighborhood to create it so that it's not a problem. But I think even that, at its best, the reduction of crime, we saw it. There were great relationship building. In fact, the city of Coral Springs recognized that community-based policing was so efficient because of process improvement that they went to community-based government. Again, asking those who work on the line, hey, is there a better way for us to do this? Is there a more efficient process? So figuring out processes and working. We won like all these awards, like the Sterling Award and the Baldrige Award, and it was all well and good. But here I am, almost 10 years later, 15 years later, going, well, that was great. I mean, we helped reduce crime. We helped, quality of life issues. And now I'm reading the material that was bringing tears to my eyes that was saying, I didn't have to suffer like this.
Right.
I did not have to suffer because everything in law enforcement, when you're working, from my perspective, was learning sequences. Those sequences were really, really hard. And when I started looking at the research that the doc had done and the efficiency of it and the effect, it made perfect sense. I'm not a neuroscientist.
Right.
I was working on my master's degree, but I didn't have PhD, and I wasn't there's an old joke, it may be a little bit gallows humor, but, as a police sniper, we are considered brain surgeons. So I said, well, I'm not really a brain surgeon, but, and we kind of laugh about it. Somebody will get mad about that, and I don't mean to offend anyone. But from my perspective, and again, that's probably one of the things that I would say most dyslexic people are, we're very blunt, because remember, we are seeing everything, and that's the way we perceive everything. We have to see everything. So to learn to read, you have to have good language. Well, you get by on your language by listening and watching, but your ability to transfer that to reading and decoding words or figure out what the codes and what the phonological awareness is not there. So you have to push harder at paying attention. So being blunt, I think, might be part of, I hate the folks that call it a superpower.
I would say that it is it's a product of.
Right. It's just it's a byproduct. Sorry.
Absolutely.
Here I am at 56 years old, and I still have to, and I've been with my wife for 36 years. She's like, sometimes when you speak to people, you may not mean it, but you're being condescending, and it's a drag. But I think it is. I've talked to other folks that are dealing with the same type of disorders, and they're like, yeah. Is it a filter? I don't know. Maybe it's just because we work with the right side of our brain instead of the left side, and the way we filter and see things is pretty blunt and frank. But bottom line was, I said, this is a simple solution. I looked at the doc's research, and, you're talking about a program that runs between 140 and 160 hours at its max. And I may be off on my numbers. The doc always corrects me because he's a super genius. He's a brain scientist. I'm just a cop. But his initial research was 80 hours.
Right.
And not only were they successful at 80 hours of bringing them, but a year later, they looked at the research and said, yeah, these kids are at level or above. And then they said, let's go back 2 years at level or above. And I said, well, I want to get some of this. Can I do this?
Right.
Am I too old? And that's where I learned about neuroplasticity. Now, neuroplasticity is the ability to build those new pathways in your brain when you're teaching people. And it doesn't matter how old they are. It's just a matter of if they're willing to learn. Well, as an adult trainer, I knew that training people, adults learn by imitation, repetition, trial, and error. And unfortunately, the primary format for how training is delivered to adults, specifically in tactics and procedures, is usually trial and error, which means try it, and if it works, okay, great. If it doesn't, as opposed to here's the right way to do it, imitate me, set these standards, which neuroplasticity says, hey, we're building those pathways in your brain to do it right. And as you're learning it, you're imitating somebody that's doing it properly. Because remember, if I'm dyslexic, I'm basing my reading on my language. And if I have trouble with my language, phonological awareness, I can't quite fine tune the things that I need to read correctly. But when you're teaching people those tactics, you got to try and do that. So it made perfect sense to me. And I just said, well, hey, if we can do it with an adult, imitation, repetition, and then trial and error, that's perfect. Because imitation, I get you to a level, clean it up. Repetition, we do it enough so that it builds that conscious and subconscious competencies. See, a lot of people, when you're teaching physical or tactics, they'll say, well, it's muscle memory. Well, there's no such thing as muscle memory. Your muscles don't have memory unless you're doing like certain types of exercises. You have to change them up. So that's why we have like CrossFit and all these other things. But we have conscious competencies and unconscious or subconscious competencies. And I knew that. So when the doc started talking to me about neuroplasticity and building pathways and rebuilding them, and it doesn't matter how old you are, I went, man, that makes perfect sense. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've stayed at a couple of Holiday Inns and I've trained a lot of people, and I've seen the things he was talking about, where they just go, well, that's the way I do things. I got it, but it doesn't make it right.
Right.
So can we fix it? P.S. Let's fast forward. After a year of doing all that research, I realized, to me, the simplest solution to this problem, if you will, is how do we teach people to read? Well, the way we're teaching them to read ain't working, because when you look at the numbers, for the last 25 years, we've been below proficiency in this country across the board. And those come out of the education department. And the one thing I had to avoid is trying to say something negative about the way educators do things, because I work in a school now, and I'm a law enforcement officer coming into this educational world, and I'm walking this very gentle pathway not to get out of, we don't do discipline. We have to be careful where we get involved, when we get involved and how they feel it. I mean, there's a ton of like things that could go sideways, and we've seen that. Where you see a law enforcement officer come into a room and try and remove somebody because it's a discipline issue and not a legal issue. That law enforcement officer gets jammed up. And what was it for? It should have been discipline, which means, we should have been doing discipline has to come from the school. So again, I see a lot of that going on. However, being in the school setting, I said, I don't want to critique anybody. I just think we've got a portion of our society that is having a big problem. Some of it has to do with dyslexia. Some of it has to do with learning disorder. As to me telling educators how to educate people, not really my place. And as my wife said, that's a hornet's nest you don't want to poke, and she's absolutely correct. Mm-hmm. So my thoughts are, okay, let's look at what we know. So here's what we know. If we're able to stop a kid from getting into the system, they've got a greater likelihood of not getting into the system. I know that sounds simple, but it's true. So on a first-time offense, for example, in the state of Florida, we have what's called a civil citation. It's a diversion program. And we're not going to put you in the court system. So if we keep you out of the court system and are maybe able to do some sort of programming with you, or, some sort of pick up trash, talk to, some sort of program that helps them do something, there's a whole criteria. They have probably an 80% likelihood of not ending up back in the system again, because sometimes kids just make mistakes. It happens. And I said, well, chances are, if we know that 80% of the people, 50 to 80%, half to almost 3/4 of the folks that are incarcerated have some type of reading disorder. I said, hey, what if we just did a screening? When I said the word screening, Steve, you would have thought I set a fire in the office where I was sitting. They're like, screening? You can't do that. You got to have all kinds of, degrees and letters. And I'm like, oh, okay. I said, how about we just ask them if they like reading? And they're like, well, you could do that. Now, anecdotally, I have talked to kids that are struggling, that I think are having trouble discipline and some other issues. And I've said, hey, you like reading? And they're like, no, don't like it at all. Why not? It's boring. Okay, so what does that mean? I mean, if we really get down to it, two things. One, they don't read because they don't read. And the reason they don't read is because they probably can't. Two, when you read, that means you're using your imagination. When somebody says, I can't read or I don't, they won't ever say I can't. They'll just say, I don't like to.
Mm-hmm. Especially at that age.
At any age. At any age. I don't care if you're in elementary school or in high school or you're an adult like me. It's like, yeah, sometimes it's kind of hard to concentrate. Yeah, Dave. Now, I found books that I was able to read and struggle through and go, yeah, like Tom Clancy, because there's a guy that he painted pictures so brightly, comprehension. Because remember, back to being dyslexic is being able to decode, figure out the letters, figure out the sounds, figure out how they come together, and then being able to relate them and then have comprehension, which is the movie in your head. Well, when you're dyslexic, that movie there's a lot of snow coming in and out. You have to really struggle to say, what did I just read? You'll read a whole page and go, what did I just read? I got to go back. Or you just go, moving on. Or you'll read, like one of the examples I give people is I read out loud for them. Now I can read pretty good out loud, but I said, you hear how slow that is? They're like, no, it was nice to listen to. I said, you don't read that slow when you read to yourself. You read a lot faster because your ability to flow through it. I said, if there's 6 words in that sentence, I've got to read each word. And as I'm reading the word, I have to remember, what is that word? They call it sight lexicon. I'm trying to remember, is that word? Because my ability to sound words out is really rough or has been changing recently, but the ability to do that was very difficult, so I'd have to remember the words. So they call it sight lexicon or sight words. So, for example, one of the words that the doc uses, and it's great, how do you pronounce yacht if you were going to spell it out and pronounce it? You can't. You got to remember the word. So that's a sight word. Well, for somebody like me, every word I'm reading is a sight word. I'm trying to remember what it is. And by the time I get to the 5th or 6th word, I have to go back and go, what were all those words? What's the context of them? How do they go together? And I'm like the guy on the TV show that's spinning plates. And as I get to the last plate, I got to go back and respin the first plate and make sure I'm getting all the plates spun. Well, by the time I get to the end of the page, I've got 30, 40, 50 lines, and I'm trying to spin all the pages or the plates to remember what I read. That's the struggle. So back to a kid who goes, yeah, it's just boring. It's boring because it's laborious or it's laborious. It takes a lot of effort. And at some point they just go, I'll put on a video game, I'll watch TV, I'll go to the internet. Why? Because it's simple. But what it tells me is their imaginations are shut down. And what's one of the primary top 3 killers of kids in this country today, Steve? Suicide. Yep. Specifically,
it's the second most killer of teenagers. Well, it's elementary to 20-something.
Yeah. So just a couple of notes. $250 billion a year we spend on incarcerating people in this country. $140 billion a year we spend on mental health. People say we don't spend enough on either of those. So back to my point. Okay, what's the simplest solution? Well, if most of the people that are in prison can't read, can we assume, I think so, can we assume that it may have something to do with them not being able to read? Okay, can it be the way we're teaching them? Well, everybody else gets it. Eventually they'll get it. They'll catch on, but they're not. So where are they? They're at a place where they're feeling depressed or upset. Hey, I remember it. I remember going through, listening to the teacher going, David, you're very smart, but you're lazy. And I'm like, dude, do you know how hard it is for me to read this? And I had no clue. Up to and including the police academy and being a police officer, and then eventually becoming a sniper where there's a lot of technical reading that had to be done and understanding math. Here's the example I'll give for you. When you learn math, like a squared times b squared equals c squared, you have to do all the math in algebra. Well, a lot of that I could do in my head because I could visualize it in my head. Well, if I'm on a 10-story building and the target is lased out to 185 yards, it's not from the 10th story and 185 yards because gravity doesn't care that I'm on the 10th story. It's actually the distance from the bottom of the building to my target. So I could do that math in my head. Why? Because I could visualize it. again, you got these kids that are incapable and adults that are incapable of reading and visualizing what they're reading, and there lies the problem. So my whole premise was, well, what if we gave them 80 hours? I mean, the doc's original research was 80, and the only reason they gave them 80 is because that's all they could afford. Because, I mean, I can only guess at what the cost is for that, but in my mind, I'm like, okay, let's give them 80 hours, and then how about we give them like 10 hours of life skills? Because if they're having trouble in school, if they've gotten arrested, they probably have all kinds of other stuff that's going on. And it may include mental health, like, you know, they're dealing with depression or self-medicating, because what's also on that top list is alcoholism and narcotics abuse. Well, gee, why do you think they're doing that? Well, they just like to party.
No.
Not so much.
No.
Not much. Just talk to an alcoholic and they'll tell you, you know, yeah, I did it not because I liked it. I mean, it may have been fun, but there was a price to pay and I was self-medicating. Well, again, I'm not like an expert, but I can pretty much say that if it's blaring and the window's broken, here's a good way to fix it.
Right.
Because we've got kids that aren't able to read. They're not succeeding in school, or they're struggling. And now listen, just so you know where I'm at, there is evil in the world. And where there is evil, that's what law enforcement needs to do. That's one of their jobs. But if I look at the problem from a wide perspective and go 50 to 80% are struggling with reading, the national scores haven't changed. Am I going to change that? And you and I have had this discussion. No way. I am not fighting DOE at a state or a federal level. However, if I say, tell you what, give me those kids that are tough, that have gotten civil citations. Let me just ask them a couple of questions. Hey, you like reading? No. You willing to do something that might help your grades? Sure. Okay, here's what we're going to do. An hour a day, I'm going to put you either in front of a person or a computer with a person at the other end, and I'm going to help. They're going to help you get better at reading. Yes or no? And try it. It'll be an hour a day. It'll be 2 hours a day, either for 80 or 100 hours. Right now, I'm still trying to get them convinced that, hey, let's try it. Let's see what happens. If I'm wrong, no worries. If I'm right, heck, in a couple of months, you might see a big change. So as you know, every school district in this country is fighting to keep their numbers right, correct?
Correct.
And they got all kinds of different scales for the kids that are in the upper percentile, the kids that are ESC. We're not even allowed to call them ESC. They have IEPs, all these fancy terms. That's one of the things you have to learn when you become a school resource officer, is you got to learn all the terms and which terms you can talk about, which ones you can't. You know, am I getting an individual? Is he, you know, what's his IQ? What's his curriculum? Is he there? Is it a discipline thing? I said, tell you what, civil citation kids, give me an hour a day at their school where they're going to sit in front of a computer, or 50 minutes, or twice a day. I don't care, whatever you're willing to give me. More is always better for this particular, because of fidelity and intensity of training. The more that you're doing it, the better that it is, the easier it is to learn the material, which I knew from adult education. I'm also learning now as I'm relearning to read. Let's do that. One of the concerns is, well, there's a state requirement that, you know, they have to do reading for an hour a day. Okay, I'm telling you, this kid probably has a reading. So let's not go around with it. Give me an hour.
Let me go ahead and just tell you that kid ain't reading for an hour a day. How do I know that? Because I was that kid.
Right. Exactly. And you wouldn't know that unless you were the kid who is dyslexic like me and you.
Right.
And the bottom line is what they're saying is, well, hey, listen, it's working for most of our kids. And I look at it like this, and we had this discussion. And one of the person that I've been talking to said, well, how do you know this is going to work? Well, there's this little thing called a gold standard where they do double blind testing, and it's RCT and research and all these fancy names, but it's a standard by which we deliver medical treatment. Okay, that makes sense. So my kid had cancer when he was 17 years old. Now, anybody that's dealt with either a serious injury or something like that, when they go to the doctor, they don't go to the doctor and go, and the doctor doesn't go, well, you know, we're going to try this procedure that's kind of based on science, and it's worked pretty good a couple of times, or for the most part? Or do they say, this is scientifically proven protocols, this is what we're going to do? For example, you got a broken leg. Hey, here's some crutches, some aspirin, put some ice on. You should be okay. Walk it off, kid. Well, it might work if you have a sprain, but it ain't going to work if you have a fracture.
Well, I mean, you take it even further than that. Hey, look, I don't know, personally, because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a medical person, I'm not a teacher, but what I do know is that what we're doing now isn't working for a subset of people.
No, for 20% at least. And actually, I think one of the statistics that we're listening to is 64% are struggling to reach proficiency. And there ain't no way that all those folks are dyslexic. But, again, here's the way I'm looking at this. When I was a kid, they had a thing called polio. Most people don't know what polio is anymore. But I remember my mom was handicapped, so we went to the Rusk Institute, the NYU University Hospital, and I remember walking by these rooms and hearing Darth Vader. That's where Darth Vader came from, in my opinion. And I'm like, what is that? And they're like, and we stood at the door, and they're like, oh, that's an iron lung. And there was a kid in one of them, and I said, hey, how you doing? And I was like, hey, can I go talk? Because I was bored to tears because my mom was doing rehabilitation because she was a stroke victim, and they're like, no, you can't go in there. I mean, they have the door open because they want to get air in, because they needed fresh air. But that's an iron lung. Well, I don't know about you, but I remember taking a polio vaccine and taking the boosters. Now, if you ask somebody today, what's polio and what's the results of it, how many people would really know that? Unless they have like a grandparent or an uncle or a great uncle who's actually still on crutches, limping around with their hips and legs degenerated from.
They may have known or know the word, but to know what it is, most people won't.
Right. And here's my point. I don't think everybody jumped up and down when Dr. Salk said, hey, listen, if we give this to every kid, they're going to be okay. And the reality is Dr. Conway's methodology, just from looking at, and it's not just his. I mean, we're talking about 30 years of research and proven methodology. It works. And the one research program that they have is that if you give it to kids in elementary school between kindergarten and like third or fourth grade, by the time they're done with elementary school, you'll never know they had dyslexia or a reading disorder. And I'm like, Doc, this is a vaccine. He's like, yeah. I'm like, why are we fighting this fight? Why are we not just saying, let's give the kids a vaccine? And the issue is, and unfortunately, and I say this very gently, the methodology that we're utilizing to teach people to read works for the most, but doesn't work for all of them. And it's only because it's not proven methodology. So now we have scientific proof. And again, if you were sick and my dad, and I walked into the doctor and he says, well, maybe we'll try this. I say, well, what's proven to work? If we had not tried that first, then we could go to, hey, I got an idea, hold my beer. But we're talking about scientifically proven, here it is. And here's the short term, here's how well it can work. So, they got the Einstein School up in Central Florida. That thing's been open for a number of years. And the Morris Center, which I think is 30 years. I mean, how much research can you bury these guys with to say, hey, look at the numbers. What you're doing isn't working.
Well, I mean, you go back to the studies that I've shared with you, and you're looking at when we talk about numbers, I'm not talking about individual numbers. I'm talking about you're saving millions upon millions of dollars.
Yes.
Just teaching these kids to read, or these adults at that point, because they're already incarcerated. But, nobody's done, or I've never found any valid research or numbers that shows what is the economic impact on the incarcerated people. When you take that person out of our economy and they're not able to go out there and
right.
Work and pay taxes and whatever else, what how much does that impact us?
Here's a rhetorical question for you. Why are there so many people that are working minimum wage jobs that are supposed to be starting jobs asking for a cost of living increase when we grew up recognizing that those were starter jobs? And they're saying, well, that's what I have to do to support my family. Well, we know a high school diploma, you're in like 25 to 35% likelihood of living in poverty. So how much money are we pouring out? I mean, again, $250 billion for incarceration. Okay, what if we reduce that by 5%, 10%? I don't know. I mean, I can't speculate, but I can say this is, let's give them the vaccine. So again, back to me and bringing it back to where I'm at is, hey, I'll start out with just a small little group of kids that may be first-time offenders. Let's see if we can get a couple of them that are interested. And then prevention, tell you what, give me the kids that are in the lowest 25 percentile, because dyslexia is not an intellectual issue. It's a reading issue. It's a decoding. It's figuring out the rhythm of the letters and the phonological way. So give me those. I'll help change. Let me see what I can do with them. And if I'm successful with that, then we can do enrichment, maybe take the next step, because the bottom line is trying to fix the big machine. I just don't think this is the discussion I had with my wife, who's a genius. I said, how do we do this? Do we go from the top or do we go from the bottom? And I said, she's like, listen, the only way you're getting traction is as a law enforcement officer doing what law enforcement officers do. So we look at it as a crime prevention and intervention. And I'm like, okay. So either they're going to say yes or they're going to say no. The only reason they'd say no is because, well, we can't take away from their educational program. If I can show them the statistical proof that it's already being used, and it is that, that's where I get the train. And for me, once somebody says yes, then it's just raising the money to do it.
Right.
I know that sounds silly, but that's the easy part. They're like, how are we going to pay for it? Education and law enforcement? Come on.
Well,
I mean,
that old saying, how do you eat an elephant?
One bite at a time.
One bite at a time. But in this scenario,
that's a long story.
Yeah. Well, in this scenario, it's how do you eat the elephant? Well, we got to bring everybody to the party. We need everybody, all hands on deck, bring the entire village. Let's eat this elephant. That's how we're going to eat the elephant. We need to, just like you were saying, and what's awesome is you and I basically came to this. I mean, well, it's not like,
right. It's not brain surgery.
Yeah. It's not like I really came up with this, but when I'm looking at, the Juvenile Justice Center, and we're looking at the amount of kids that we're sending to truancy court, I mean, that's kind of where my first step was. Okay, if we're not going to do this for everybody in the school system now, why don't we start with a Juvenile Justice Center or truancy? As soon as they're going to truancy court, you're immediately testing those kids, or you're going through a screening questionnaire, whatever it is, about
what do you got to lose? What do you got to lose?
About education, because I don't know any kids, unless they're sick, that is going to end up in truancy because they love school.
Right.
That's just not, I don't understand that. I can't wrap my brain around it. So, let's start there. And let's that's also going to curb a lot of the behavior issues that we're dealing with in our educational system. And we're stopping these kids from going to prison. Because you and I both know, you being in law enforcement and me being on my end, looking at the school system and seeing these kids being lined up, ready to go. Now, with that being said, I'm not saying that every kid that has dyslexia is going to go to prison or, this, that, or the other. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is there's a whole lot of them that do. And it's because of frustration. It's because of lack of education. It's because of not being able to get that job. It's because of the feeling of inadequacy and not being able to make the right decisions.
Agreed.
So you can actually get out there and, like you were saying, provide for my family.
And there's all the ancillary stuff that goes with this. We'll hear about the kids that are ADHD and have attention deficit. And as a dyslexic guy, I went, well, that makes perfect sense, because any of those added attention difficulties, well, yeah, I can't read. So I'm going to have even less patience to focus. So imagine if we're able to work with them and be able to say, okay, well, we know that there's some disciplinary issues and again, I'm not getting into the whole discussion about medication and how we do that, but think about it. If I've got attention, like some types of attention deficit, where I can't really focus on stuff, and, as somebody that can focus for a bit, I get bored and go, yeah, I can't do this, hit the button and go. Imagine how they're doing. It's like this big magnifying glass. So again, my thoughts are, what do we got to lose? Because what we're doing really is like not working. I mean, yeah, we got kids in our school in the top percentile that are reading 200 books a year. Woohoo! I wish I could read 200 books a year. That's really hard.
Slow down a little, Dave. Let's work with two books a year, okay?
Yeah, right. Let me get through my emails,
Right.
and make sure I didn't miss anything. So again, Steve, I think the whole point is I'm not trying to change a machine. I'm just saying, hey, I can see a squeaky wheel right here that's broken, and if you just let me work with that one wheel, hey, just give me the check in the box. Give me a little bit of support. Again, back to the concept of Robert Greenlee, process improvement. If we allow the people that are on the ground to go, you know what? Give me some tools. I see where there's a problem. I'm willing to work to make it work, but I don't want to hear, well, we don't do things that way. Well, okay. Well, you'll keep getting what you're getting, and we'll keep paying what we're paying. And, I think you'll probably agree with this also is, there's a lot of parents that just don't know. They don't know. They don't know what to do.
They're so frustrated. They're tired of hearing that their kid is lazy and stupid and is going to. I mean, because we know this. We know this. I had a conversation with a principal the other day, and I go, "What do you becoming a principal? What did they always tell you about a child who has ADHD? They're dyslexic, and they drop out of high school. What do they tell you about that child?" And he goes, "Nothing good's going to come of it." I said, exactly. So if we already know this, if we already know the symptoms, we need to do more. We need to stop this before it ever happens. We don't need to do triage and stop the bleeding 6 years down the road. We need to do it now. Let's don't open the wound.
Well, and I think this comes back to some of the different things that you and I were talking about. They passed this big crime bill last year about, that everybody bipartisan, voted on. And one of the tenets of it was evaluating convicts as they came in for dyslexia. In fact, I think there were some calls received from either Utah or Colorado where they're testing everyone. They take a DNA swab and fingerprint.
It's Louisiana.
And then they're checking to see if they can read or not. And the reality is they're finding out. And here's the problem. Here's really where it is. So I got a kid in school. Let's say he or she is in kindergarten or first grade, second grade, third grade. They're just right in there. And they're having trouble keeping up. They go in, they get their IEP, their individual education program, and that might be all kinds of services, blah, blah, blah. And they recognize this kid's got some issues. So they put them in some type of tier program. And every district in the state of Florida is different because they're each individual. But, there's state mandates, but they do things the way they do things in each district. And it's probably no different than any other state. And then what happens is they kind of put it. So here's kind of what it looks like. I have trouble in class learning what you're teaching me to learn, reading. And they're like, well, we'll put them in a smaller group or we'll do individual. So now here I am, not only not in class, but now I'm one-on-one with somebody who's like, this is how we read. So now they're teaching me the same stuff they were teaching me in class, and now I got even more pressure on me. And I don't think they recognize that's what's occurring. So now I'm just trying to get past being individually helped I guess it'll help a little bit. Maybe they'll get some sight words or sight recognition, but actually getting to what they need, they're getting more pressure because now they're in that. And now they do this whole program. And if at any point during the process of the 2 or 3 tier program, they either stop or say, well, they're doing better, so we'll take them out, they got to start over.
Right.
It could be a year or 2 years. It could be like 3 years. And the parents are like, and on part of this, I feel really bad for the parents. I also feel bad for some of the schools, because you have really, really dedicated people who are teachers who they spend tons of money on curriculum, but how efficient is the curriculum that they're actually providing them with for the needs of these kids that they have? Do they actually have the tools they need? Are they law enforcement officers that are rolling out on the street in the middle of the summer in cars with no air conditioning, no vests, old wheel guns, and 30-year-old technology or 50-year-old technology? I don't know. I mean, I'm looking and I see all these really dedicated. For the most part, teachers are really dedicated.
Oh, absolutely.
The pay ain't that great. I can say that.
Yeah.
And some have some tough working environments.
Look, we're here to support. We're here to be a part of the solution.
Right.
However, I'm ready to get off the pay now or pay later train.
Right.
I am all about pay now. Let's do it now. But so what I'm going to ask for is I'm going to ask for some of our legislators to step up to the plate, help us out. Let's do some pilot programs. If you have the ability to help put some pilot programs like this in place in Florida, in Texas, or wherever we can get it put in place, so we can start looking at what does it really look like when we start teaching these kids to read at an earlier level and stopping the incarceration of our children, stopping that pipeline to prison. What does that really look like? We change generations. So,
right.
But Dave, I want to continue this conversation, but we're up against the time. We've actually gone over quite a bit, but this conversation is way too important to not go over our time. I want to have you back, and let's continue this conversation, because I want to talk about when you're looking at the discipline problems. I know that you're not necessarily in part of the discipline problem until it gets to a point where police involvement needs to be there. But I want to talk about those kids also. I know what we're talking about them anyway, but I want to talk about when you're dealing with those kids and what that looks like, because I don't think a lot of people understand that those are the kids that we're talking about. Those are the kids that are struggling so much. Those are the kids that are dying literally and figuratively to learn to read. They want to get there. So, but I want to have you back on very, very soon. Maybe we can do this. Obviously, we need to do this in a multi-part series. I want to bring you back on in the next week or so. Let's continue this conversation. It is so important for us to make sure that we bring as much light to this situation and get some real help for our kids, and make sure that we once and for all destroy this pipeline to prison.
I'm with you. It'd be my pleasure.
I want to thank you for all that you do. Our children need that. And I'm so proud of you. Keep doing all the great work that you're doing. And
well, if we can get it off the ground. I mean, I didn't realize that there'd be such a battle, but it's not like people they're not fighting with me. It's just, understanding, hey, it's not that hard. We can do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm in the fight with you. I'll stand shoulder to shoulder with you any day, all day. So,
thanks, Steve.
From one dyslexic to another, let's go.
Sounds great.
So, all right, Dave, at the end of every show, we talk about understanding what is going on with your child when they start having learning disabilities or they're struggling in school. So one of the things that we always recommend is that you don't wait, go get your child tested. All school districts, public school districts, provide testing for any type of learning disability, any type of other disabilities. So you can go to our website, www.empowerdyslexia.info, and on there we have templates. You can download the template, fill in your information, turn it into your school counselor, and get the process started. You will be so happy that you did. Your child will be happy because then they can understand that they can do it with the appropriate help and accommodations. So please get in there and get that thing started. Don't wait. So until next time, thank you so much for tuning in. Remember, please like us on Facebook, follow us, subscribe, leave us comments. We love to hear from you. And I want to thank all of our sponsors, and we'll hear from them right now. But until then, we'll see you next time.
Learning Ally is a proud sponsor of the Empower Dyslexia podcast. At Learning Ally, we are always looking for new ways to engage readers struggling with a reading deficit like dyslexia and help them work to their potential. Visit www.learningally.org to learn about the Learning Ally audiobook solution, including which of your students are eligible for access. If you live in Texas, we have great news. The Texas Education Agency provides access to the Learning Ally audiobook solution for all K-12 public and charter school students with reading deficits. Get started today by visiting www.learningally.org/Texas.